Welcome to a place where hearts unwind, infinite threads that gently bind, love and compassion in every line. Together we rise through space and time.
Hey, welcome back to Infinite Threads. I'm your host, Bob. There's a version of grace that most people are comfortable with. It is the kind we give when someone apologizes quickly, when they explain themselves well, when their mistake is understandable enough that forgiveness feels easy and natural. But that's not the kind of grace that changes us. The grace that transforms people usually arrives in more difficult moments. It appears when irritation would be easier, when judgment would feel justified, when another person has failed to give us the warmth, patience, or understanding we had hoped for. Real grace is not passive. It is a decision, a choice. And I think many of us misunderstand what that decision actually means. Grace doesn't mean to become blind to harm. It does not mean allowing people to walk over us while we quietly absorb the damage either. It's not pretending everything is okay when something inside us clearly knows it is not. Grace is something much more grounded than that. Grace is the choice not to become unnecessarily hard in response to life. And that may sound simple, but it becomes more difficult the longer we live. Life has a way of tempting us toward hardness. Disappointment can do it, betrayal can do it, exhaustion can do it. Sometimes people go through so many painful experiences that they begin protecting themselves by assuming the worst before the worst has even happened. And after a while, that mindset can start to feel normal. We become quicker to react, quicker to assume disrespect, quicker to answer coldness with coldness. Not because we're cruel people, but because we are tired of being hurt. The problem is that pain often disguises itself as wisdom. A person may say, I just see people for who they really are now. When what has actually happened is that disappointment has slowly trained them to expect less goodness from everyone around them. That expectation changes the energy we bring into our relationships. We stop entering moments openly and we begin entering them defensively. Grace interrupts that pattern. It says, I refuse to let my past pain decide the tone of every future encounter. And that does not mean that we stop being discerning. Wisdom matters. Boundaries matter. Some people really do manipulate, deceive, or repeatedly wound others. And love does not require us to ignore reality. But grace leaves room for humanity before it leaves room for condemnation. There's a big difference between being cautious and becoming cynical. Cynicism assumes that people will disappoint us before they even have the chance to show us who they are. Over time, it can quietly poison relationships that might otherwise have become beautiful things. Grace keeps the heart from closing completely. Sometimes that grace looks very small from the outside. Maybe somebody speaks sharply to you and instead of matching their tone, you answer calmly. Or maybe someone disappoints you in a minor way and you decide not to turn it into a larger emotional wound. Or perhaps a person you love is clearly struggling, and instead of demanding perfection from them in that moment, you give them a little room to breathe. Those choices matter more than we realize because grace changes emotional momentum. Without grace, frustration tends to grow. A harsh tone creates another harsh tone. Defensiveness creates more defensiveness. And before long, two people are no longer responding to the original issue at all. They're reaching or reacting to the emotional weight that has accumulated around it. Grace can stop that escalation before it takes over. And often, the most meaningful grace is the kind that nobody notices except the person receiving it. The friend who was bracing for criticism but instead received patience, or the exhausted parent who expected judgment and instead received understanding. The person having a terrible day who suddenly realizes someone is speaking to them gently instead of adding more pressure. Those moments, guys, those moments stay with people. Not because grace solves every problem instantly, but because it reminds us that human beings do not have to relate to each other through constant emotional collisions. There is another side to this too. Sometimes the person who most needs your grace is yourself. That's something we forget a lot. Many people speak to themselves with a level of cruelty that they would never direct toward another human being. One mistake becomes a permanent identity. One failure becomes proof that they are broken or incapable of growth. But growth rarely survives in an environment of constant self-hatred. Grace toward ourselves is not the denial of responsibility. It is the refusal to believe that our worst moments are our final definition. And that matters deeply because people who cannot give themselves grace often struggle to give it to others. Their inner world becomes so rigid that every imperfection feels threatening, both in themselves and in the people around them. A graceful person is not someone who never gets frustrated. It is someone who remembers that being human is difficult sometimes. That understanding softens the edges of how we move through the world. It changes marriages, it changes friendships, it changes families, it changes ordinary encounters with strangers that we may never see again. Not because grace is weak either, but because grace prevents unnecessary suffering from multiplying. And maybe that, if you think about it, that's one of the most important things that we can realize. Every moment does not need to become a battle. Not every misunderstanding requires emotional escalation, and not every flaw needs to be magnified. Not every difficult day needs to spread itself into 5 more lives before it ends. You know, sometimes love enters quietly. Sometimes love looks like restraint. Sometimes love looks like the decision to keep your heart open when life has given you many reasons to close it. That kind of grace is not accidental. It is chosen again and again. And every time we choose it, we help create a world where people can breathe a little easier around one another. A world where human beings are allowed to be imperfect without immediately becoming enemies. A world where love is not just something we feel when conditions are ideal, but something we practice deliberately when they are not. That is the kind of grace that changes people. Because when someone receives it at the exact moment they expected judgment, something inside them often softens too. And sometimes that softening is where healing begins, guys. I say it over and over again in these episodes. We make choices. We're responsible for our choices that we make. And it's all up to us. How we respond is up to us. And I love you guys very, very, very much. And you know what I need you to do, right? Go out and pass that on. Later, Gators. Bye-bye.